On the afternoon of February 11th, 1979, the CIA station chief in Tehran sat at his desk on the third floor of the United States Embassy and stared at filing cabinets containing 16 years of operational records. The cabinets held the accumulated documentation of CIA operations in Iran dating back to 1963, agent recruitment files, operational cables, surveillance reports, contact lists, safe house addresses, financial records, and the real identities of Iranian nationals who had worked with American intelligence over nearly 2 decades. Outside the embassy compound, the sounds of celebration had been building throughout the day. The Iranian Revolution that had been gathering momentum for more than a year had reached its conclusion. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who had ruled Iran since 1941 and who had been one of the United States' closest allies in the Middle East, had fled the country 2 weeks earlier, on January 16th. That morning, forces loyal to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had overwhelmed the last remaining units of the Imperial Iranian Army that had attempted to maintain order in the capital. The revolution had succeeded, and the government that had been friendly to American interests for more than 3 decades had fallen. Before we continue, if you're interested in the hidden costs of Cold War intelligence operations and the real human consequences behind classified documents, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We examine declassified cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind intelligence failures. Now, let's examine how the events of this single afternoon would lead to one of the worst compromises in CIA history. For the CIA officers working under diplomatic cover at the embassy, the immediate concern was not political or strategic, but operational and practical. The question was what to do with the files. According to declassified State Department cables, there had been discussions throughout January about whether to destroy sensitive materials or to attempt to evacuate them. The decision had been complicated by conflicting assessments about how much danger the embassy actually faced, and by bureaucratic resistance to destroying what represented years of intelligence work. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran occupied a 27-acre compound in the center of the city, on Takht Jamshid Avenue. The compound included the main Chancery building, several residential buildings for embassy staff, recreational facilities, and various administrative structures. The CIA station operated from offices on the 3rd floor of the Chancery, behind doors marked with innocuous titles like Political Section and Economic Affairs. Security protocols required that all classified materials be stored in locked safes when not in use, and that officers follow strict procedures for handling sensitive documents. The station chief had been serving in Tehran since 1977. He had joined the CIA in the early 1960s and had served in stations in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Western Europe before being assigned to Iran. According to declassified CIA personnel records, officers who worked with him described him as methodical, cautious, and deeply committed to proper procedures. Discussions about the handling of sensitive materials in Tehran had been ongoing since late December 1978, when it became increasingly clear that the Shah's government might fall. On January 4, 1979, the U.S. ambassador to Iran, William Sullivan, had sent a cable to Washington recommending that the embassy begin reducing its American staff and preparing for the possibility of a complete evacuation. The cable noted that public order is deteriorating and that the security situation for American personnel is becoming increasingly unpredictable. The CIA's response had been divided. Some officials at Langley, Virginia, the agency's headquarters, had argued for maintaining operations in Tehran as long as possible, believing that intelligence collection during a revolutionary period was precisely when the agency's presence was most valuable. Others had argued for a complete withdrawal of personnel and the destruction of all operational files before they could be compromised. The debate continued through January while the situation in Iran deteriorated. By early February, the compromise position that emerged was to reduce the CIA presence to a skeleton staff while beginning the process of destroying files deemed particularly sensitive. The destruction was supposed to be methodical and selective, burning documents that could not be allowed to fall into hostile hands, while preserving material that might be valuable for future operations or that could be safely evacuated. But the events of February 11th moved faster than anyone at the embassy had anticipated. The collapse of the last pro-Shah military forces occurred with unexpected speed, and by early afternoon it was clear that revolutionary forces would soon control all of Tehran. Ambassador Sullivan sent an urgent cable to Washington that afternoon, stating that the situation has deteriorated beyond our ability to maintain security and recommending immediate destruction of all classified materials. That afternoon, the station chief received authorization from CIA headquarters to begin emergency destruction of the station's operational files. What followed was not the orderly, selective destruction that had been planned, but a frantic attempt to eliminate years of operational records in a matter of hours. The embassy had three primary methods for destroying classified documents: cross-cut shredders that reduced paper to strips, incinerators in the basement of the Chancery building, and metal drums in the courtyard where documents could be burned. Under normal circumstances, the destruction of classified materials was a careful process that ensured complete elimination of all information. Under the circumstances of February 11th, normal procedures were impossible. According to later accounts from embassy personnel documented in Mark Bowden's Guests of the Ayatollah, the CIA officers worked frantically to feed documents into the shredders. The shredders, however, were designed for regular office use and were not capable of processing the volume of material that needed to be destroyed. Equipment failures and mechanical breakdowns from overuse slowed the process significantly. The incinerators in the basement proved equally problematic. The volume of paper being fed into them exceeded their capacity, causing them to smoke heavily, and, according to later testimony, to set off fire alarms in the building. Embassy security personnel reported that smoke was visible from outside the compound, potentially drawing attention to what was occurring inside. With the shredders struggling and the incinerators overwhelmed, the CIA officers resorted to filling metal drums in the courtyard with documents and burning them. Photographs taken by Iranian civilians from buildings adjacent to the embassy compound that afternoon show columns of black smoke rising from multiple points within the embassy grounds. But even this proved insufficient. As the afternoon progressed, the station chief and his officers faced the reality that they were not going to be able to destroy everything. The filing cabinet still contained thousands of pages of operational records. The burn drums in the courtyard were full of smoldering paper that had not burned completely. The shredders had produced large bags filled with shredded documents, but even shredded, the material represented a potential security compromise if it could be reconstructed. The decision was made to continue shredding remaining documents using the available equipment, even though this would not result in complete destruction. The logic was that shredded documents would at least not be immediately readable and might be sufficiently damaged to prevent reconstruction. The alternative, leaving intact files that could be easily read, seemed worse. According to embassy records cited in declassified State Department cables, the shredding continued into the evening. By nightfall, the majority of the CIA station's files had been destroyed in one form or another, burned, shredded, or torn into pieces. The remaining material was stuffed into bags and piled in a storage room, with the intention of destroying them the following day if circumstances permitted. The following day, circumstances did not permit. Revolutionary forces, while not immediately hostile to the American embassy, had established control over the surrounding area. The embassy compound became effectively isolated, with Iranian Revolutionary Guards stationed outside the gates and American personnel instructed to remain inside and avoid any actions that might provoke confrontation. On February 14, 1979, 3 days after the fall of the Shah's government, a group of Iranian militants affiliated with revolutionary factions briefly occupied the embassy compound. The occupation lasted only a few hours before Ayatollah Khomeini's representatives negotiated the militants' departure, but during those hours, the militants had access to parts of the embassy building, including areas where destroyed and partially destroyed documents were stored. It was during this brief occupation that bags of shredded documents were taken from the embassy. According to later accounts documented in the published volumes, The militants filled several large sacks with shredded paper from the CIA section and removed them from the compound before departing. At the time, American officials assumed that shredded documents would be useless to anyone who seized them. The assumption was that even if someone wanted to reconstruct shredded files, the task would be so labor-intensive and time-consuming as to be effectively impossible. This assumption did not hold. Following the brief February occupation, the embassy returned to an uneasy status. Some American personnel remained at the compound, though the embassy was operating with reduced staff and limited functions. The CIA station was effectively non-operational. Most of the officers who had been in Tehran on February 11th were evacuated in stages over the following weeks. The situation remained tense but relatively stable through the spring and summer of 1979. The new Iranian government, while hostile to American influence, had not yet completely severed diplomatic relations. The embassy continued to function in a limited capacity. Then, on November 4th, 1979, approximately 9 months after the initial February occupation, a much larger group of Iranian militants, students who called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, stormed the embassy compound and took 52 American diplomats and embassy personnel hostage. This occupation was not brief. It would last 404 days, ending only on January 20th, 1981. During the occupation, the militants gained access to every part of the embassy compound. They found filing cabinets, safes, storage rooms, and, most significantly, materials that had not been fully destroyed on February 11th. Among the leaders of the student militants who occupied the embassy was Masume Ebtekar, who was 21 years old in November 1979 and served as the English-language spokesperson for the hostage-takers. In interviews she gave years later, Ebtekar described the moment when the militants discovered the bags of shredded documents. According to her account, the initial reaction was frustration that the Americans had destroyed so much material, but then someone suggested that perhaps the documents could be reconstructed. The shredders used at the embassy had cut the documents into strips approximately 1/8 of an inch wide and 1 to 2 inches long. A single page might be cut into 40 or 50 strips, and the strips from different pages were mixed together in the bags. Reconstructing even one page would require finding the correct strips among thousands of others, determining their proper sequence, and assembling them in the right order. But Iran in 1979 and 1980 was a country with certain resources in abundance. One of those resources was motivated labor. The revolutionary government, eager to establish the extent of American intelligence operations and to justify its seizure of the embassy, was willing to commit significant resources to recovering whatever information the shredded documents might contain. In December 1979, approximately 1 month after the embassy seizure, the Iranian government established what it called the Document Center within a building in Tehran. The center's stated purpose was to recover and publish evidence of American espionage and intervention in Iran. The work of reconstructing shredded documents was assigned primarily to women, workers at carpet factories, teachers, and others who had experience with detailed manual work requiring patience and visual acuity. The process developed by the Document Center was methodical. The shredded strips were sorted first by type of paper: standard white typing paper, colored paper, onion skin carbon paper used for copies, and cardstock. Then workers would look for strips that had distinctive markings, letterheads, signatures, stamps, or handwriting that might indicate what document they came from. Once a potential document was identified, workers would search through bags of shredded strips looking for pieces that matched in color, paper type, font, and content. According to accounts published in the document volume's introductions, a single page might take hours to reconstruct. Workers would lay out strips on large tables, experimenting with different arrangements, looking for strips where the text or images aligned. When strips were found that appeared to go together, they were taped onto backing sheets. The reconstructed pages were photographed to create permanent records, then checked by supervisors who reviewed the work for accuracy. The work continued day after day, month after month. By the middle of 1980, The Document Center employed more than 100 workers who were engaged full-time in reconstructing shredded American documents. The first publication of reconstructed documents occurred in April 1980, approximately 5 months after the embassy seizure and 4 months after the reconstruction work had begun. The Iranian government published a book titled Documents from the U.S. Espionage Den, Volume 1, which contained approximately 300 pages of reconstructed documents. The volume's introduction stated that these documents, which American spies attempted to destroy, have been recovered by the people of Iran and are published as evidence of American crimes. The documents in Volume 1 included embassy cables, intelligence reports, lists of Iranian contacts, and internal CIA memoranda. Many of the documents were routine: diplomatic reporting, administrative communications, requests for supplies or personnel, but some were highly sensitive. They included names of Iranian nationals who had provided information to the CIA, descriptions of surveillance operations targeting Iranian officials, and assessments of political factions within Iran. Among the documents in Volume 1 was correspondence between the Tehran station and CIA headquarters discussing the recruitment and handling of Iranian sources. The documents contained operational details, meeting locations, communication methods, assessment of sources' reliability, and access that made individuals immediately identifiable to Iranian security services. One cable discussed meetings with Iranian military officers concerned about political instability in the months before the revolution. The cable included positions held by the officers, their expressed concerns about the Shah's government, and evaluations of their potential usefulness as intelligence sources. The publication caused immediate concern within the U.S. intelligence community. The documents revealed operational methods, sources, and capabilities. More immediately and tragically, they exposed Iranians who had cooperated with American intelligence. According to human rights organizations including Amnesty International, individuals named in the published documents were arrested by Iranian authorities in the months and years following publication. Some were imprisoned for years. Documented reports indicate that several individuals were executed on espionage charges, though the Iranian government did not publish comprehensive lists of those arrested or their fates. Volume 1 was just the beginning. Over the following years, the Iranian government published volume after volume of reconstructed documents. By 1991, the series had reached 77 volumes, containing more than 30,000 pages of material recovered from what had been bags of shredded strips. The volumes were published in both Persian and English editions. The Persian editions were distributed within Iran to support the government's anti-American narrative. The English editions were distributed internationally, sent to libraries, universities, and media organizations around the world. The stated purpose was to demonstrate the extent of American espionage operations and to justify Iran's revolutionary government and its actions. For the CIA, the publication of these documents represented one of the most significant intelligence compromises of the Cold War era. The documents revealed not just what operations had been conducted in Iran, but how the CIA operated more generally, its recruitment methods, its communication protocols, its assessment procedures, and its relationship with other U.S. government agencies. Among the published volumes were documents related to CIA assessments of Iranian political factions and military capabilities, financial records showing payments made to Iranian sources over several years, surveillance reports on Soviet activities in Iran, and communications between the Tehran station and CIA headquarters regarding covert operations. The documents provided detailed insight into how the CIA identified potential sources, made initial approaches, developed relationships over time, and managed ongoing intelligence collection. The specificity and comprehensiveness of the published materials gave researchers, journalists, and intelligence analysts around the world access to a volume of internal CIA documentation that would normally have remained classified for decades. While the documents related specifically to Iran, they provided insights into CIA methods and operations that were applicable more broadly. The documents also became source material for books, articles, and academic studies about U.S.-Iran relations, intelligence operations, and the 1979 revolution. Mark Bowden's 2006 book, Guests of the Ayatollah, drew extensively on the reconstructed documents to provide detailed accounts of CIA operations in Iran before the revolution and of the hostage crisis itself. Academic researchers published studies analyzing the document's revelations about American policy toward Iran during the Shah's era. The Library of Congress acquired a complete set of the 77 volumes and made them available to researchers. The collection remains there, cataloged as documents from the U.S. Espionage Den, a permanent record of one of the most unusual intelligence compromises in history, not the result of a spy or a defector or a cybersecurity breach, but of patient manual labor by workers reassembling strips of paper that were supposed to have been destroyed. The incident raised questions about what alternative courses of action might have been available. The CIA had several options for handling the files in Tehran as the revolution approached. The files could have been evacuated weeks or months earlier, shipped out of Iran through diplomatic pouches, or by other means before the security situation deteriorated. The risk was that evacuating large volumes of documents might have been noticed and might have provoked an incident. There was also bureaucratic resistance to abandoning the Tehran station and removing all its operational records, which would have signaled a complete loss of confidence in the U.S. relationship with Iran. The files could have been destroyed earlier, before the February crisis. This would have eliminated the time pressure that contributed to the inadequate destruction. However, destroying the files weeks or months before they were actually seized would have meant eliminating intelligence resources that might have proven valuable if the situation had stabilized. The files could have been destroyed more thoroughly on February 11th. This would have required either having adequate shredding and burning equipment on hand to handle the volume of material, or making the decision to destroy the files earlier when there would have been more time to do so properly. Each option involved risks and trade-offs. The option that was actually chosen, attempting to destroy the files at the last possible moment using inadequate equipment, proved to be ineffective, but it was a decision made under extreme time pressure with imperfect information about how events would unfold. The incident led to significant changes in how U.S. embassies and intelligence stations handled sensitive materials. Following the Iran experience, the State Department and CIA established more rigorous protocols for document destruction. According to declassified State Department directives from 1981, new requirements included high-capacity shredders capable of cross-cutting documents into particles small enough that reconstruction would be effectively impossible. Embassies were required to maintain emergency destruction plans that specified exactly what materials would be destroyed and in what order if evacuation or emergency destruction became necessary. The National Security Agency developed standards for different levels of document destruction, with higher security facilities required to have equipment capable of preventing any possibility of reconstruction. These standards were implemented at embassies and intelligence stations worldwide, though implementation took several years and required significant equipment purchases. The incident also highlighted the risks of maintaining large volumes of operational records at overseas stations. Following Iran, the CIA moved toward more centralized record keeping, with stations maintaining only minimal documentation on site and transmitting detailed records to headquarters for storage. This reduced the risk of compromise, but also created new challenges for stations that needed quick access to historical operational information. For the Iranians who had worked with American intelligence and whose identities appeared in the reconstructed documents, the consequences were severe. While exact numbers remain disputed due to the Iranian government's lack of transparency about arrests and executions during the early revolutionary period, human rights organizations documented multiple cases of individuals arrested after their cooperation with the CIA was revealed in the published volumes. These were individuals who had made decisions during the Shah's era to cooperate with American intelligence for various reasons, some ideological, some financial, some personal. When the revolution came, those decisions made them targets. The publication of the documents made the targeting more systematic. For the CIA officers who had recruited and handled these sources, the knowledge that their sources were being arrested and potentially killed because of documents that should have been destroyed was deeply troubling. Several officers who had served in Tehran before the revolution reported in later years that they struggled with the outcome. They had made assurances, often implicit rather than explicit, that the people who helped them would be protected, that their identities would be kept secret. The failure to destroy the documents represented a failure to uphold those assurances. The impact extended beyond individuals to families. When someone was arrested for espionage in revolutionary Iran, their family members often faced consequences as well. Children of accused collaborators were denied educational opportunities. Spouses lost employment. Extended family members faced social stigma. The 52 American hostages held at the embassy from November 1979 to January 1981 were eventually released as part of a complex diplomatic agreement mediated by Algeria. The terms of the agreement, finalized through the Algiers Accords, included the release of frozen Iranian assets held by the United States and other provisions. The hostages returned to the United States on January 20th, 1981, ending their captivity. During their captivity, the hostages had no involvement with the document reconstruction work, which was conducted at a separate location. However, some hostages later learned that documents they had written or that mentioned them had been reconstructed and published. According to interviews documented in Bowden's research, several former hostages described the experience of seeing their private communications exposed as disturbing and invasive. From a historical perspective, the 77 volumes of published documents provided researchers with an unprecedented window into CIA operations during the Cold War era. Researchers could see how the CIA recruited sources, how it communicated with them, how it assessed the reliability of information, how it coordinated with the State Department and other government agencies, and how it made decisions about what operations to pursue. Academic studies of intelligence operations have traditionally been hampered by the fact that most intelligence records remain classified for decades. The Iran documents, because they were published by a foreign government rather than being officially declassified by the U.S. government, became available to researchers much sooner than they otherwise would have been. This created an unusual situation where information that the U.S. government wanted to keep secret was nonetheless publicly available because of the compromise. The U.S. government's response to the publication of the documents was constrained. Officially, the government could not acknowledge the authenticity of specific documents without confirming details of intelligence operations. The standard response to inquiries about the published materials was no comment or statements that the government does not confirm or deny intelligence activities. However, the volume and detail of the published documents, combined with their clear provenance from the embassy, made their authenticity difficult to dispute. For researchers and journalists, the documents were treated as authentic, while there was theoretical possibility that the Iranian government might have inserted fabricated documents into the published volumes for propaganda purposes. No definitive cases of fabrication were identified by researchers who examined the materials closely. The technological aspect of the reconstruction work was notable for its manual nature. The reconstruction of the shredded documents was done entirely by hand, using human visual pattern matching abilities rather than any automated process. It would be several decades before computer technology advanced to the point where automated document reconstruction from shredded pieces would become feasible, and even then, the human-intensive approach used in Iran proved effective for the mixed materials and varied document types involved. The incident led to changes in shredder specifications for U.S. government facilities. The National Security Agency developed detailed standards for different levels of document destruction based on classification level and sensitivity. These standards were implemented at embassies and intelligence stations worldwide, though implementation required several years and significant equipment purchases. For Iran, the publication of the documents served the government's purposes for many years, but eventually became less politically relevant as the revolutionary period receded into history. By the 1990s, the documents were primarily of interest to historians and researchers rather than being active propaganda tools. The document center that had coordinated the Reconstruction work was closed in the early 1990s after the final volumes were published, and the original reconstructed pages were archived. The question of responsibility for the failure to adequately destroy the documents is complicated because multiple factors contributed to the outcome. At one level, the officers in Tehran bear responsibility for not acting sooner to destroy files when the security situation was deteriorating. At another level, officials at CIA headquarters bear responsibility for not providing clearer guidance and for not ensuring that the Tehran station had adequate equipment for emergency destruction. At another level, the State Department and the U.S. government more broadly bear responsibility for not recognizing earlier how serious the threat to the embassy was and for not ordering a more complete evacuation and destruction of materials before February 11th. But beyond individual and institutional responsibility, the incident reflects broader realities about intelligence operations in revolutionary situations. Intelligence agencies accumulate information and build networks over years or decades. When political situations change suddenly and dramatically, as they did in Iran in 1979, the very accumulation of information and contacts that represents success during stable periods becomes a vulnerability. Files that document productive operations become evidence of interference. Contacts who were valuable sources become targets for reprisal. The same pattern has repeated in other revolutionary situations. When communist forces took Saigon in 1975, American personnel destroyed documents and evacuated contacts in chaotic circumstances, and some materials and people were left behind. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, KGB files became accessible to researchers, and some former Soviet intelligence sources were exposed. The specific circumstances differ, but the underlying challenge is the same: how to manage the accumulated products of intelligence work when the political foundation that made that work possible suddenly disappears. The station chief who ordered the emergency destruction on February 11th, 1979, continued his career with the CIA after leaving Tehran, serving in various positions at headquarters and in other overseas stations. According to declassified CIA personnel records, he retired from the agency in the mid-1990s. The publication of the reconstructed documents remained, according to colleagues, a significant event in his career that he reflected on in later years. For the Iranian women who spent years reconstructing the shredded documents, the work was both routine employment and contribution to what they understood as a revolutionary cause. The work required patience, visual acuity, and sustained concentration. The process of finding matching strips, arranging them in proper sequence, and taping them to backing sheets was methodical and time-consuming. The workers understood that they were recovering evidence of American intelligence activities in Iran, and many believed they were contributing to their country by exposing foreign interference. The work provided employment during a period of economic disruption following the revolution, and it offered a sense of purpose and participation in the revolutionary project. The broader question raised by the episode is about the gap between intention and outcome in intelligence work. The officers who recruited Iranian sources believed they were building networks that would provide valuable intelligence about a strategically important country. They believed they were operating within a framework where the Shah's government would continue and where American-Iranian cooperation would remain a foundation of Middle Eastern stability. Those beliefs did not hold. The decision to destroy files on February 11th was made with the expectation that adequate destruction was possible and that shredding would render documents unreadable. That assumption was mistaken. The calculation that reconstruction would be too difficult to be practical proved unfounded. The cumulative effect of these incorrect assumptions was a compromise that exposed sources, revealed methods, and provided adversaries with detailed knowledge of CIA operations. The human cost included arrests, imprisonments, and executions of people who had cooperated with American intelligence. The operational cost included the loss of networks, built over years and the exposure of methods that would need to be changed. The institutional cost included damage to the CIA's reputation and confidence in its ability to protect its sources and operations. The incident remains, more than 4 decades later, a case study in what can go wrong when political situations change faster than institutions can adapt, when equipment proves inadequate to the demands placed on it, when assumptions about what is possible turn out to be incorrect, and when the accumulated products of years of work become liabilities rather than assets. The filing cabinet that the station chief had stared at on that February afternoon contained documentation of operations, sources, and activities stretching back to 1963. The decision about what to do with those files had to be made in hours. The consequences of how those files were handled extended for decades and affected hundreds of lives in ways that could never be fully documented or understood. The bags of shredded paper that were supposed to have been destroyed became, through patient labor over many years, 30,000 pages of published documents. The sources who were supposed to have been protected became targets for arrest. The operations that were supposed to remain secret became public knowledge, and the decisions made under extreme pressure in the hours of February 11th, 1979, had consequences that extended far beyond what anyone involved could have anticipated. The 77 volumes sit now in research libraries, available to anyone who wants to examine them. They are historical documents, evidence of a particular moment in American-Iranian relations, primary sources for understanding CIA operations during the Cold War era. They are also evidence of what happens when institutions fail to protect the people who trust them, when equipment proves inadequate to the task demanded of it, and when events move faster than plans can accommodate. The workers who reconstructed the documents, strip by strip, page by page, over months and years, completed their task. The volumes were published, distributed, cataloged, and archived. The people named in the documents faced consequences. The officers who had recruited them faced different consequences. The institution that had failed to protect its files implemented new procedures to prevent similar failures, and the historical record gained thousands of pages of documentation that would otherwise have remained classified for decades, if not permanently. That is what remains of February 11th, 1979. Not the smoke rising from the embassy courtyard, not the broken shredders or the overwhelmed incinerators, not the frantic hours of attempted destruction, but 77 volumes of reconstructed documents that tell a story about intelligence operations, revolutionary change, and the human cost of both.